Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix. In this episode, we're going to be discussing intellectual self-defense in the form of being familiar with errors of logic, the informal logical fallacies. There's quite a few of these. They're widespread in modern propaganda. They're widespread in modern Western culture, to be quite honest, certainly here in England. And we need to be aware of these so that we can spot them in any arguments that we're hearing and taking on board, in any justification for policies or anything like that. We also need to be aware of them so that we don't use them when we try to say what's right and what's wrong and what's true and what isn't. So, two reasons to really know about these logical fallacies. It's being forewarned of logical traps. And I must say up front that this collection of informal fallacies is taken from Leonard Peikoff's basic course in logic, which is available on YouTube, should you want to go and indulge in the whole 9 yards, as it were. So all gratitude to Leonard Peikoff, largely his work. Some of the examples are mine, and but it's basically my presentation and interpretation of a small fraction of his course on logic. So let's kick off. I'm going to give the Latin names as well as the colloquial ones, just so that you can know that and research them up. So the first one we're going to look at is argumentum ad verecundiam, and this is the appeal to reverence. And there are two main forms of this fallacy. One essentially known as the appeal to majority, and the other one known as the appeal to authority. But they're both basically an appeal to other. So let's look at the first one. The appeal to majority is what's known as the quantitative form. And in this, one or more people believe something, therefore it's true. And this is essentially a fallacy of the intellectually dependent. It's a fallacy because of the primacy of existence, because things are what they are. A is A, independent of anyone's thoughts or feelings or say-so. And the fallacy is just to assume that something is true because everybody else holds it to be true. It's following the crowd, essentially. In abdicating our own thought process, in renouncing our own reasoning, we tend to recognize, if subconsciously, that we need knowledge, and so we sort of look left and right and look around us, figure out what everybody else believes and adopt that. And this fallacy kind of assumes that one or two people could be wrong, but not everyone. And the wishful thinking assumption really that's at the heart of this fallacy is that all people do their own reasoning, is that everybody thinks things through and arrives at their conclusions, but of course they don't. The story of the Emperor's New Clothes is an example of this, where everybody is pointing at the Emperor and joining in on the story that he has fabulous clothes on, when in fact he's naked, and it takes the child to actually call it out and say the Emperor's naked. Everybody else is going along with the crowd, with what everybody else thinks. So it's really important to note, as we look at the news narrative these days, we look at everything going on in the world around us in Western culture, it's really important to note that the widespread acceptance of an idea means nothing with respect to its truth or falsity. Not logically, and not even on a probability basis. It's really important for us to do our own thinking. So the second form of this is the qualitative form, and this is the appeal to authority, where essentially an expert is wheeled in, or a charismatic leader or a politician, or science. We're following the science, and this is generally the appeal to somebody who allegedly knows best. Therefore, don't think for yourself, just swallow this one. And of course, this fallacy is used by propagandists, is used by somebody selling an argument. So we have to be very, very skeptical when we hear things like we're following the science and all this sort of things. We have to be prepared to think for ourselves, is the bottom line on this one. Particularly when science is evoked, scientists are just individual men and women, and when they report on their observed findings, they can be believed if they have good evidence, and hopefully if they're practicing proper science. But if they're theorizing, there's a great tendency to follow the dominant philosophical trends of the time, and at the moment rationality is not a conspicuous trait of our general philosophy, and unfortunately scientists will follow suit. So basically we have to defer to authority with care. We have to recognize that nothing is true just because somebody says it is. We have to make a point of identifying the reasons why something is held to be true. So if we are deferring to an authority, whether we're getting our car fixed or whether we're going to the doctors to get a diagnosis, we have to be very engaged. We have to check the credentials of that particular source or that particular mechanic or doctor. We have to look at track record, trustworthiness, all these sorts of things. And we have to listen to the logic of what's being said to us. If your local motor mechanic shop is explaining something fantastic and unlikely, then we have to be able to spot that. We have to keep our thinking caps on. And also be aware of jargon, of course. Sometimes technical jargon can be thrown in to try and impress the unwary. So that's something to look out for. And essentially we must focus on logic, not the presenter or the delivery. So that's veracundiam. Second one we're going to look at here is argumentum ad baculum, and this means appeal to physical force or threat of harm. This fallacy essentially amounts to might is right, but of course we have to remember that reason and force are actually opposites. So the idea of accepting an argument under threat of force is complete nonsense. And yet you will hear the supernatural version of this argument is that believe in God or else you'll go to hell. That's argumentum ad baculum. And in modern schooling we find the same when we get accept it, learn this, or you won't pass your exams. That's threat of a different kind of force. And then also terrorism is another example as well, where force is being used as a means of reason, allegedly, but that's another thing. Third one I want to look at is argumentum ad hominem, and there are two slight differences on this one. It's basically the appeal to the man, or attacking the man to disprove an idea without actually addressing the idea or the argument itself. It's basically just a slur on the message deliverer, and it's like an opposite of veracundiam, where you specifically do believe a point because this person or this doctor or this charismatic leader has said it. And with ad hominem, you're specifically, or somebody is trying to dissuade you of an argument by pointing out that the man isn't you know, a respected expert. He's a scoundrel, or some such. So it's also very common to hear people psychologize with this. With you hear things like, you know, how could such a what sort of depraved mind could have come up with this? What could possibly have motivated somebody to think this, and things like that. So it's important to separate psychology from reasoning, and it's okay to attack the man if he is a scoundrel. It's okay to point out flaws in people's character, but not to do so, not to mix that up with an argument. Isolate the argument, listen to the argument, and then attack the individual, if appropriate, totally separately. So there's another version of this ad hominem, and it's called circumstantial. And it's essentially raising the idea of the other person's contradictory beliefs. So some other sort of flaws, you know, with regards to the other person. And again, there's nothing wrong with pointing out contradictions. But the point is that we must reason against the argument and not any of these aspects of the messenger or the deliverer of the argument. Next, I'd like to look at the appeal to emotion. Now, this is used in two senses. Individuals use it in their own, I hesitate to say thought process, but in their own consciousness, in their own adoption of ideas. People will tend to consult their feelings rather than look at the facts and reason something through to find out why this is claimed to be true or why that is not true. So it's important to notice that our emotions are very useful, they're fantastic things, but they're not the tool that you should reach for if you want to know what's true. There's nothing wrong with emotions. There are means of enjoying life, but you have to pick up the right tool for the job. And if you want to find out what's true, then you can't be reaching for your emotions. You have to be using your cognitive skills, your capacity to reason, think things through, look for reasons why. So that's the sense in which this logical fallacy is used by individuals. And it's also, on the other side of the coin, it's exploited by propagandists and sophists and would-be evildoers trying to mislead people who will play on your emotions. And this form of the fallacy is called ad populam, the appeal to the group, to the mob, to the crowd, the gallery, the tribe. And it's the appeal to the emotions of the masses by a particular speaker or speech writer or whatever, propagandist. And, you know, Hitler was very good at this. Why he was hailed as such a good charismatic leader. He was great at whipping the crowd up into a frenzy. But the bottom line is that whether or not you're listening to newsreel or whether you're within your own mind introspecting, it's important to really fully grasp that emotions are not your means of discerning truth. Your emotions are fabulous things, a great component of the human experience, but they are simply not the means of establishing truth. It has to be reason that does that. And on that topic, I do refer you back to episode 165, Epistemology, the Fundamentals of How to Know What's True, if you'd like to look into that further. So number 5 here is argumentum ignorantium, which translates from the Latin to appeal to ignorance. This is the fallacy of asserting an idea is true because it hasn't been proven false, or assuming an idea is false because it hasn't yet been proven true. Most commonly, we see this fallacy in the form of somebody challenging us to prove that it isn't so. prove that you can't do this, etc., etc. And the point to remember here is that it's impossible to prove a negative, and it's essentially irrational to demand it. There needs to be a positive, an existent thing in order to have any mark on reality. So something that doesn't exist, like green gremlins, because they don't exist, they're nothing, they don't exist anywhere. You can't point to any evidence of them. They don't impact reality in any way, shape or form. So there is, by definition, no evidence anywhere in reality to prove that something doesn't exist. It's a nonsense to prove that something doesn't exist. The onus is always on the person asserting the positive. So if somebody wants to assert that gremlins exist or that God exists, the onus is on them to produce some evidence. It's impossible to prove a negative. You know, it's very, very common to hear people say things like, you can't prove that there is no God. You can't prove that heaven doesn't exist. You know, therefore these things must be possible. And the answer is no. It doesn't mean that anything's possible if you can't find any evidence with it. You always have to find some positive evidence to back up any idea or claim. How do you know that there isn't life on Mars? Yeah. All of these forms of the questions are logically flawed at the outset. The how do you know that it isn't so format. The bottom line is, a thing to remember is that you always have to have some positive evidence to bring forth to back up any claim for it to be taken seriously. Number 6 is begging the question in ordinary English, and the Latin name for it is petitio principii, for those serious scholars that would like to delve into this more deeply. And begging the question is the logical fallacy of using the point or the argument that you're trying to prove in the process of trying to prove it, using or assuming the point as part of the proof. And it's important to remember that in essence the premises of your argument must be distinct from the conclusion. It must be possible to establish the premises without establishing the conclusion, essentially, okay? So this begging the question fallacy, which is very common amongst ordinary people like you and I, and we're trying to have conversations with people, and we're trying to wake people up, as they say. We're trying to spread the word, and we have to be aware of this tendency, this fallacy of using the argument in trying to explain it and give reasons for it. So it comes in 4 forms, and I'll just give you a brief example of each one, and hopefully you'll find that illuminating. The first form is common just restatement. So you're essentially saying the crux of the argument in one form and then repeating it in another form. Here's an example. Capital punishment for murderers is justified because there are good reasons to put to death people who have committed murder. Well, we can see there that by saying there are good reasons to put people to death who've committed murder is simply another way of saying capital punishment is justified. Here's a second example very briefly. It's right to give money to beggars because it's your moral duty. And of course, moral duty is just another way of saying that's the right thing to do. The second form of this is arbitrary redefinition. So somebody might start off an argument, and then somebody picks them up on one aspect of it, and then they'll try to redefine a key concept within the argument, and they'll arrive right back where they started. So here's just a little example. Somebody comes up to you perhaps and says, all Christians are virtuous. And you go, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, because Mr. Jones, he's a Christian, and he's involved in child molestation and drug trafficking, etc., etc. And then your opponent comes back and says, but Mr. Jones isn't a Christian. And you say, well, why? And then he says, well, because he isn't virtuous. Obviously, to be a Christian, you have to be virtuous. Why? You say, how do you justify that definition that equates Christians with virtue? And he says, because all Christians are virtuous. You haven't really got anywhere, have you? So it does have to be said that it's okay to use definitions in one's argument, as long as you're not switching things around halfway through. Pointing to a valid definition is pointing to a legitimate definition is a valid way of a valid form of argument. The third form is circular reasoning, and this is when you use one idea to prove another, and then that one to prove another, and then that one to come back and prove the first one again. You're reasoning round in a circle, and you haven't actually proven anything new. And there's a classic example of such reasoning in the sphere of economics, where a guy goes into a bank for a loan, and he takes a friend along to him, and he's asking for $20,000, and the banker says to him, well, I've got no means to no one to vouch for your character. I need some security. And so the man says, I thought about that, and I brought my friend along. He can vouch for me. I've known him for 10 years, and he can be my character reference. And the banker says, but I don't know this gentleman. And you say to him, well, that's okay. I've known him for 10 years, and I can vouch for him. And you've just gone full circle and haven't shown anything. So the last form of begging the question is something called using a question begging epithet. And you'll hear this in the classic sort of courtroom scene, if you like, where a barrister might say, I will show that this killer entered the room and then he blah 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 blah. And you've effectively in pointing to or naming that person as the killer, you've already made the judgment that of what you're then going to try to go on to prove. So it's quite common and subtle, begging the question, and it is, as I said earlier, maybe it's understandable, because if you believe something sincerely and it becomes a part of your thinking, it is quite easy to simply restate it in a different form. And the way to avoid it, this is the important punchline, the way to avoid it is to be able to prove your conclusion from premises that are independent of the conclusion. That's really important. The next one I'm going to look at is sometimes called by three different forms. It's sometimes called the complex question, or a leading question, or the loaded question. Now this is a fallacy in which a question includes two or more elements, and again, this is widely used in the media to brush aside any further questions, and I hope to illustrate this. A fact is assumed without warrant or proof, and then you ask a question on this basis. And the assumption is a presupposition of the question. So when you hear on the news, how are we going to avoid the next pandemic? Well, that assumes that the previous one was fully legitimate, and there are no questions about that. Another one would be how are we going to deal with climate change? This assumes already that there is a problem to be concerned about with the climate, so it moves you past the first point and quickly on to another, assuming the main question. And this can be used in all sorts of different ways. So always be on the listen out, specifically in the news media, mainstream media, when you hear a question, how are we going to do something something, what is already presupposed in there. And there was quite an amusing example of that with the question, have you stopped beating your wife yet? And of course this question sort of sucks you in. There is no way to answer that question without admitting that you're beating your wife, or you have been. And so you have to sort of stand back from the question right from the outset and say that's unanswerable. Let's unpack it. And what are you assuming? What are you asking? Etc. etc. So that is the fallacy of the loaded question, or the leading question. The next one I'm going to look at here is called equivocation. And again, it's another very common fallacy with respect to the modern news media, the mainstream at least. It's a key way of misleading the public. And this fallacy is made possible by ambiguity, by a word having two or more different meanings. And the fallacy consists of switching the meaning within the argument, or sometimes even within a sentence. So here's an example. Laws imply a lawgiver. The universe is governed by laws, and therefore God. And the equivocation here is on the word law. Law has two meanings. One of them here is a general principle in reality that explains multiple occurrences. And the other, of course, is an edict passed by a governing body. And the two meanings are switched or used interchangeably, and you end up with a false conclusion. Now, we see this a lot in propaganda, where meanings may be switched, but quite often meanings are wholly invented. Definitions of words like, or phrases like herd immunity, definitions of pandemic can be changed. They're changed frequently by the World Health Organization and others. Here's a classic example: the United Nations definition of climate change. It was some years ago. They've probably changed it again since then, but it was a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over considerable time periods. Now that's a very well crafted definition that enabled any UN representatives to talk straight past any objectors, because they're using their specific definition. So the fallacy of equivocation isn't just switching words. It can be completely assigning them completely new meanings. You know, when we look at the meaning of the word unemployment, for example, in the UK, I think it's changed dozens of times, if not scores of times, since the 1970s. Each time the figures need to be adjusted, the definition is changed, and with a consequential change in the figure. So that is equivocation. Be very much on your guard with equivocation. In following a line of reasoning, make sure the meanings of all the words remain consistent. And it's the same as listening to any propaganda. You kind of listen and you scratch your head and think, gosh, that doesn't quite sound right. And it can take some time to unpack what's going on logically. But equivocation, changes of meanings of words and phrases, is very commonly used these days. The next one I'm going to look at is called composition. I don't know any Latin name for this one. And this fallacy is when you find a characteristic that is true of each part as a part, or each individual as an individual, and you conclude that it must be the same for the whole as a whole. So it's the it is the inference, let me just read this out to make this absolutely clear. It is the inference in which you pass fallaciously from the fact that a certain characteristic is true of each part of a whole or each member of a group taken separately, to the conclusion that that characteristic is true of the whole as a whole, or the group as a group. So it's got to do with words being used, verbs being used distributively and collectively. Best illustrated by just diving into a load of examples. If you were to say, for example, that all men are mortal, and whatever is mortal will one day pass out of existence, therefore mankind will one day pass out of existence, become extinct. You know, that's obviously a false argument, and you can see that and think, But what that's doing is that's using a characteristic of all men as individuals and assuming that it carries over to all men as a group, as the whole race of man. Here is another example. College towns are small, small towns are numerous, therefore college towns are numerous. Doesn't follow. Here's one from the sphere of economics. If the government were to give this particular man or one particular person a subsidy of £500,000, it will improve his life. If we want to improve everybody's life, why don't we give everybody a subsidy of £500,000? Of course, that's a situation where undeniably, if you give one individual that sort of sum of money, it's going to, you know, potentially massively improve someone's someone's life, maybe by buying them a house or something. But we can see that if you simply map that out to the whole population, who's going to pay? How's it going to work? Clearly it doesn't. Here's one with regard to groups of people. If you have a football team, and if you took an imaginary football team, should we say, where you take the best player from right across the country in every position, so you take him from that team, him from that team, etc., and you assemble the dream team, and then we all know that it doesn't necessarily follow that the best player in each position will come together and you know, the team will be the best team. It doesn't necessarily follow that the team will be the best team, even though you've got the best players in each position. And the point to note here is the fact of putting things together quite often introduces another factor. So you can't simply go from the single to the collective. Hydrogen is a gas, oxygen is a gas. Water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen in the chemical formula of H2O, but of course water isn't a gas. Some other factor being introduced. And here's another classic one from metaphysics, another reason for God existing. Everything that exists needs a cause, say the religionists. The universe exists, therefore the universe must have a cause, therefore God. But the fact that every thing that exists requires a cause, which is true, doesn't pertain to the entirety of existence. One of the reasons for this, of course, is the fact that to be a cause, there's nothing outside of existence that could be the cause for it. Everything that exists is everything that exists, so there can't be a cause outside that. So again, it's a classic example where a characteristic of the individual thing, something within the universe as a whole, does require a cause, and fallaciously transferring that idea to the whole, the entirety of everything that exists. It's important to notice with this fallacy that it's not the same as generalization. Generalization is spotting characteristics of one or two members of a group and then extending that to the group, and you have to be careful with your sample pool and loads of things that can go wrong with that. But that's generalization. The fallacy of composition, you start with information about every single member of the group. You're taking a characteristic, something about every single one that you know for certain, but you're incorrectly mapping that onto the group as a group. So an important distinction with that logical fallacy. So the next one I'm going to look at is called division, which is essentially the reverse of composition. It means assuming that what is true of the whole group is necessarily true of each part or each component of it. You know, you can use the this team is the best in the country, you know, therefore all the individual players are the best in the country. No, that doesn't follow back that way, you know. And there's an amusing example that Leonard Peikoff uses, where he states that if we look at the whole of humanity as a whole, we can see that 1 in 4 children born is Chinese. Statistically speaking, that is true. But of course, when someone's expecting their 4th child, they don't need to fear that they're going to, if they're Caucasian, they're going to give birth to a Chinese child. That would be the fallacy of division, to think such a thing. Next one is the fallacy of the false alternative. Now, this essentially means that you're not seeing the full picture. All relevant possibilities must be considered. And when we are led to decide between 2 options, very often there can be a 3rd or a 4th. And another characteristic of this fallacy of the false alternative is that both of the options are in fact stemming from a false premise. So in fact both of them are completely wrong, but we tend to get stuck with them. A classic example in ethics, for example, is either we live sacrificing ourselves to others, or we sacrifice others unto ourselves. Meaning either you live as an altruist, trying to help everybody, or you go around as a monster and exploit everybody and abuse them. So of course this is a false alternative when you grasp that nobody needs to be sacrificed to anybody. No sacrificing required whatsoever. And then we're off the false premise, and we can see that there are other ethical choices that can be made. There are other systems of morality. So the fallacy of the false alternative means that there are more choices and that something is being ignored. Therefore, you could say your reasoning, or the reasoning of the thinker, is destroyed at its base. It must be said that not every alternative is a false one. It's very legitimate to have an either or. And the way to tell whether you are, genuinely dealing with an either this or that situation and not missing something out, is to employ the law of excluded middle, which says that everything is either A or not A. So if you can reduce the argument down to an either this or not this, as opposed to either this or that, or that or that, if it reduces down to either this or not this, then you have a valid alternative. So a valid either or. So that's the fallacy of the false alternative. Again, very widespread in modern philosophy, and Ayn Rand did some great work in revealing some of the false alternatives in modern philosophy. Anyway, on to the next one. This is the appeal to laughter, ridicule, or the avoidance by humour. And it's the refutation of an argument by simply not... It's the refutation of an argument by simply ignoring it and laughing it off, not taking it seriously. in formulaic terms, you could say that X is false because, ha ha ha, ha it just it's a non doesn't follow at all, and the message is implicitly that this is no threat whatsoever. We're not even going to take you seriously, and of course it makes you think about phrases like conspiracy theory being bandied around for anyone who questions anything, and it's an avoidance essentially. It's an avoidance of dealing with the argument by just laughing it off. And I mean, depending on one's character, some people can be shot down quite easily by appealing to their own self-doubt. And humour can be very devastating for the kind of person who goes through their life very much relying on positive feedback from those around them. Trying to please the group, being a social metaphysician, as Nathaniel Branden coined the term. So it can be very devastating to more insecure people. Basically, the appeal to laughter. And the last one I'm going to do now is the fallacy of the stolen concept. And this was one identified by Ayn Rand. And it essentially entails using a concept while ignoring or denying or contradicting one of the antecedent concepts on which it depends. So, and without which it couldn't be formed nor defined. So sometimes I like to think of this as cutting off the branch you're standing on. If you're climbing up a tree and you're standing on a branch, you're going to look pretty stupid if you, instead of cutting wherever you're supposed to be cutting, you actually cut the one you're standing on and you fall to the ground. This is, I think, a good metaphorical illustration of this fallacy. When people, for example, make spiritual claims such as we create our own reality, or even the existence of a deity for which there's no evidence, they are implicitly standing on the premise of the primacy of consciousness. They are assuming that consciousness creates reality, that reality is not an objective absolute. But of course it is, and everything rests on reality being an objective absolute. Everything that we do all day long, any speech, any argument, anything, all assumes that A is A. When you explain something, you intend it to mean what it means and to be what it is, not what it isn't. So we're using the law of identity even when we speak and can communicate with people, and even when we deny the law of identity. And of course the important thing about the law of identity is that it shows us that reality is an objective absolute. So this fallacy, the fallacy of the stolen concept, is about not understanding the vertical integration of your thinking. It's about not appreciating the premises on which you're standing, metaphorically speaking. So a very useful thing to be aware of, and most people most freedom fighters and health freedom activists these days stand on premises when other thoughts, they may be religious, or they may hold other beliefs that actually counter and contradict a lot of the arguments that they're making for freedom, etc., etc. So I hope this collection of informal logical fallacies is helpful to you. I hope that you can use this to guard your own thinking, as well as guard incoming ideas that we're going to hear all the time in the mainstream media, in conversations with people when we're trying to prod people into thinking. I don't like to use the term wake people up, but when we're trying to precipitate thought, when we're trying to provoke thought, it's really essential that we stand on firm logical ground. So once again, I hope this has been helpful to that end. So thank you very much for listening and or watching, whatever medium you're getting this from, and please visit the website lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more on there, and most of all, please join me again for next time in another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.